Good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to have you here. Welcome to Race Talks, Interdisciplinary Virtual Colloquium Series. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I am Dr. Mariana Gariazzo, and I will be having a wonderful conversation today with Dr. Marcela Fuentes from Northwestern University about her performance Constellations, Network of Protest and Activism in Latin American book. Before I introduce our speaker today, I will tell you a little bit more about the series. Race Talks is made possible by an Advanced Climate Together grant funded by the College of Liberal Arts, and resonating with many other diversity and inclusion efforts across universities, across the country. This colloquium series aims to invigorate campus-wide conversations on anti-racist advocacy through pedagogy, performance, and research. Race Talks is a collaborative project that is made possible by the joint efforts of 6 university units, including African Studies, the Dance Program, the Film Program, Latinx or Latino and Mexican American Studies, Performance Studies, and Religious Studies. We here in Performance Studies have a dream team of staff members who made this all possible behind the scenes, so my appreciation goes to Darlene, to Myra, and Kathy for their assistance in making all of the administrative part of the Race Talks possible. I am also thrilled to announce that, serving as a complement to the Race Talks, we are launching a student research presentation series titled Lightning Talks. And while I do this, I'm going to copy and paste here in the chat so that you can have access to it. Just give me 1 second. Awesome. Somebody's helping me with that. Great. Excellent. So the lightning talks, I was saying, these are very short, to the point, 5 minutes video presentations in which speakers will share their ideas and concepts and research that they have in progress. These short presentations offer students the opportunity to bring their research interests and unique perspectives to an intersectional campus-wide conversation about race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and faith. So we invite undergraduates and graduate students at Texas A&M to present their research, consummated projects, or ideas that show potential for future research. So you may submit your videos before or on March 15. Let's remember again, 5 minutes videos, and the website where you can find more information and submit your videos is pasted right there in the chat. Okay, so these Race Talks events happen always on Thursdays at 2 o'clock, and we have a wonderful roster of speakers that are accompanying us throughout the semester. Please make sure that you check our Race Talks website. The link was put earlier in the chat, and I hope that you can join us every week, starting actually in the month of March. To all of you joining us today, I invite you to truly demonstrate the Aggie spirit that sets this community apart. Our core values of excellence, integrity, leadership, and respect inform all of our events here in Race Talks, and all in attendance are expected to demonstrate those core values during the talk today. This is how we're going to be operating. Before I get to introduce our speaker, let me remind you that we are going to maintain ourselves on mute. Everyone in attendance will be on mute, just to ensure the best quality of sound throughout the event. And after my conversation with Dr. Fuentes, there will be some time for Q&A, so stay there. So if you want to ask your questions, you can all the time write your questions on the chat. And then I will be introducing also Professor Imhoff, Andrea Imhoff, that is the chair of the Diversity and Climate and Inclusion Committee in Performance Studies, and she will be monitoring the chat and bringing those questions to the attention of Dr. Fuentes at the end of the event. Also, at the end of this event, there will be a short survey. It takes literally a few seconds to complete for everyone in attendance to complete. So whether you are a faculty, a staff, a student, or a person that doesn't have an affiliation with TAMU, you can complete that survey, and we will appreciate that very much. And now, let me introduce our speaker of today, Dr. Marcela Fuentes, who is a performance artist and a scholar. She serves as an associate professor in the Department of Performance Studies at Northwestern University. Her work focuses on the role of performance as symbolic, embodied, and time-based event plays in sparking and sustaining collective action towards social justice. Her first book, Performance Constellations, Network of Protest and Activism in Latin America, edited by University of Michigan Press, maps out the intertwinement of street protests and digitally mediated mobilizations in contexts affected by state violence and neoliberal exploitations. She offers the concept of performance constellations to trace how notions that are central to studies of performance, such as embodiment, liveness, eventness, and site specificity, are redefined in the era of communicative capitalism and remote collectivity. She has been awarded national and international fellowships and grants, such as the Fulbright Fellowship and the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Research Grant. Her work has been published in Text and Performance Quarterly, Hemisférica, the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, Conjunto, LatFem, Moléculas Malucas, Página 12, and edited volumes on transnational and activist performance. Her research and teaching interests include tactical media, social art tactics, documentaries theater, technopolitics, digital performance, theories of embodiment, practice-based research, the digital humanities, and feminist and queer performance. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Fuentes. Hello, Dr. Fuentes, and I'll add you right here to the conversation. It is so great to have you here.
I'm talking from LA. I thank you so much, Mariana, for the presentation, for this invitation. I shout out to all of you who are doing great work. Actually, I love this series. I visited Professor Dexter's class yesterday. See some familiar faces. I'm glad you're back for more. So we have a lot to cover and to talk to you about. It's a very exciting moment. One thing I want to kind of share is that I knew this was going to happen on Zoom, but my unconscious still kind of had these images of being in a room in a lecture hall, right? And I don't know what's more scary in a way, but I'm like, wow, I still think I have to go to a lecture hall and read a lecture. So for Zoom, we thought a conversation would be a lot better, more engaging. And that put more work on Mariana, actually, who had to read closely my book, but I think she enjoyed it. And, we have a plan of great questions for today. So I hope and images. So I hope you enjoy it. And I'm looking forward to your questions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, hailing from LA, we had a number of presenters, and I want to remind everyone. I hope that I allow everyone in the waiting room. I saw that, so I hope that took care of right now. I was mentioning just now that this is truly an interdisciplinary colloquium series. So we had speakers that came from different fields of studies. We have a sociologist, we had a poet last week. Next week we're going to have a dancer and choreographer. And today our specialist is in performance studies. So close to home for many of us in the meeting today. So, Marcela, I'm going to start just framing a little bit of our conversation. You wrote this fantastic book. I truly enjoy reading it and learning a lot from it. It's called Performance Constellations, Networks of Protest and Activism in Latin America. And I was really curious about discussing with you the power of performance in articulating collective political interventions towards social justice. And so that's how that all of this really ties to our conversations on race and social justice that we are hosting this semester. Because many of us in the call might be familiar with performance studies, many of the students in the call may not. And so it would be good to start kind of framing performance and protest. How do you articulate performance, protest, and activism? So in your book, you talk about performance as a normative and subversive expressive behavior, as a crucial tool in formations of collective disobedience. So I wanted to ask you, why do people protest, and how is protest and activism realized through performance?
Great. So one thing that performance studies helps us. So performance studies is a field that looks at proper performances that we recognize as artistic, aesthetic performances, and also at things that we wouldn't understand as performance necessarily, that are, structured behavior, right? And so one thing that the field teaches us is that this practice of performance as a structured, symbolic, reiterative behavior has as much to do in, subversive, sort of like transformational actions and cultures as with normative cultures, right? Society and culture are made of performances, right? So first thing we shouldn't necessarily think is that all performances are progressive, are inclusive, are empathic, right? So as we know, from the Nazis parades, authoritarian regimes rely a lot on aesthetics and displays of power, right? To intimidate, to terrorize, to bring people to become disciplined, right? And so then the first notion is that everybody can protest, everybody can use performance in protest, and performance within. So maybe Mariana, you can show the chart actually to have an idea of how we in the field, thanks, one of the founders of the field, Richard Schechner, is good at making these graphs and putting it all in circles and in visual form. So he's saying here in his book, Performance Studies and Introduction, he's giving us an idea of what are the intentions of performance, right? To deal with the sacred and the demonic, like shamans, like how shamans perform, linking, the world that we have here and, spiritual worlds. To heal, same thing, healers, how they use rituals to have actually impact on bodies. To mark or change identities, we see this a lot with, communities that perform gender in ways that are non-normative. To teach or persuade, here we are approaching activism and protest performance. To entertain, also related, right? Like a stand-up comedy can also bring critical issues and help people think about things. And protest should be fun also, right? So entertain is like, you see all the overlaps between these circles. To make or foster community, when we go to the theater, we now know, right? Like we miss it. We go to a concert, we are together, we're witnessing something together. You can feel the bodies, how they react to what is shown on stage. So to make or foster community, same thing for protest and activism, we're doing something together. And to create beauty, right? This is something that has fallen off view, I think, sometimes. But also, like it's not just to create a spectacle, but sometimes we need to have that feel good, especially, musicians, dancers know that, for example, to dance together can be a political act. To play something together I was listening to a show yesterday that the importance of music in education, so that students in the earlier stages can understand their emotions, right? Like deal with emotions in a way that is like kind of outside of themselves, but also reflect on that. So we see all of that. So these are all the things that performance studies analyzes, and all the layers of performance in our society and cultures. I have an extra offer for you. I looked at this. I really like this definition of protest. Now going specifically to our topic today, the Latin etymology of protest is pro plus testari, right? And this means to bear witness together, to testify publicly, right? So we bear witness together, and we also we testify publicly. So this talks about two different actors there, right? To testify publicly means we are performing for an audience, right? We want to really explain and show our discontent, the ways that we think something is unfair. Say, for example, now there is a discussion about the minimum wage in Congress, and a lot of people, even in the news, are going to the numbers and trying to picture the life of somebody who makes little money. How do they make ends meet? Is this a fair thing? Is this unfair? So the pedagogical aspect. So the protest is to show discontent, to show that we think something is unfair and needs to be addressed and changed, right? Um, and the other thing to bear witness together is the public, right? How sometimes, it's not an issue that affects us, but like say police violence, maybe we, as lighter skinned people, we don't have those encounters with police, but we are listening to get to the experiences of others whose lives are deeply affected by that over determination through surveillance and control. And so here we see in protest, in the etymology of the word protest, how protesters perform for those who satisfy, who may be able to satisfy the demands, like say a protest, in the House of Representatives, and also to those who observe the claim. So because movements need to also make their case for supporters, right? So that people understand and support and augment their demands. And this is what happens on social media as well, that social media adds more layers, more opportunities for activists to make their case and ask for support, right? Black Lives Matter say, let's not do just performative allyship, right? It's not just like liking or following or trending or retweeting. It's the work we all had to do to create this social transformation so that we can stop protesting, because protesting is exhausting as well, right? So we shouldn't romanticize protest either.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's what a wonderful explanation of all the interconnections and the different dimensions of protest. And I think that this graphic help us to really connect with all the different aspects, right, of performances, of protest as performances. So another question I have was about what exactly do activists try to accomplish through performances. And I don't know if you want me to stay here in this slide or just move away from it.
Let's wait a second. Thank you for this, because I think sometimes we confuse activism with protest. So this gives me the opportunity to also talk about a colleague of mine, Soini Madison, who has a book called Acts of Activism. So she says, let's go back to this question, the word that is included in activism, which is action, right? And precisely as being a performance studies scholar, she asks us to really look at how activism happens and how performance as a lens, as an analytic, helps us identify what is scripted in a protest and what is spontaneous, right? So even though we are more and more talking about, dissenter movements, leaderless movements, organizers are key, right? And this is where the word activist comes to the question. Um, some people say activist seems that there is a job, that somebody is an expert on something, and we should all be activists, actually, right? So this is, I believe, John Smuckler, who talks about that, right? He questions the idea of activism. We talk in Latin America, we talk more about militancy, right? Like having something long term. So it's not just like I show up to a protest and then I don't do anything else. I don't do quotidian acts, like say for those interested in climate change. We know that, right? Climate change requires an everyday activism, right? And so what we can see is the interrelation between this idea of organizers, planned actions, and then also like the less spectacular, less fun, more, boring issue of sustaining struggles, going to to the law, assemblies, the everyday exhausting labor of activism, right? But uh, and some even question why we pay so much attention to performative protests and less to organizing. Say, for example, within the pandemic, what do we know about like workers who are organizing in their places of labor, the eventual strike, but then also what is happening, how people are like, even like farm workers, what is happening there. We should also illuminate those areas that are less talked about. So we can go now, because I'm moving to the question of choreography. We can go to a beloved example, which is the thesis from Chile, who are actually talking through their performance about the not just police violence as events that we can see that are very shocking, but also the culture of rape, right? So like something that permeates our patriarchal societies as integrally tied to police violence, as like also sometimes quotidian events, but that draw more attention perhaps. And so this is like to show one notion of protest performance in which this is a flash mob. Las Tesis is a collective of, I believe, five women from Valparaiso, Chile, who do actually, they started making theater based on feminist writings, right? Like theory, right? So for you who are studying, you see how, what the value of theory. So what is actually the issue at play? How can we transform the world? Because activists, we should also read. It's not just like performing, right? The connection between practice and theory. And so what they do is like they were preparing a play, and because of the 2019 October 2019 social insurgency against neoliberalism, a big social disruption, they were not able to open their play, but they performed this 3 minutes. You can see how effective it was. 3 minute choreography where they gathered under a common rhythm, and everybody dressed as they wanted, and kind of relating to the right to dress as one wants without that calling for sexual violence, right? And so what is, if you can go back to the previous slide, so these movements actually call on to the issue of how female and trans and cisgender women related to narrated events of violence, of police violence, how they were particularly targeted by the police during this insurgency, and the things that the humiliating and abusive things that they were asked to do. So this is the negative part. This is the denunciation, police making them submissive. And the other slide is the other gesture that they added to their choreography the gesture of rebellion and the gesture of we won't take this. So in 3 minutes, the choreography incorporates the losing part, the victim part, and the empowerment part, right? And this, so this is a, like to show not only for them that they had space for, empowering themselves through collectivity and talking back to power, but also for others, right? And as you know, this choreography was restaged all over the world. So we first witnessed it, and then we reenacted, adapting it to our particular context. So this is the notion of, it's kind of like closer to performance proper, an artistic act, a thing that was scripted, that was thought out, a template that could be restaged. And then we have the other example, a couple like the Thriller, which comes from 2011, the struggle, Chilean students really making a case for education to be free so that students could be released from debt. And so they use the image of, they use the zombie flash mob, which is a genre already of performance, uh, to talk about how depleted, how debt takes a toll on the future, on their futures, on their bodies concretely, right? And each one of them, here it says, I died owing 335 million pesos, right? So each of them made visible the individual debt, which is a lot, right? So it was an act of denunciation of something that was normalized, that you should ask for a loan to go to school, right? And in that context, they made the case for education to be public. So for the next one, so these, as you can see, are choreographed. Protesters teach each other the choreography on YouTube. They gather to rehearse. The cacerolazo or pots and pans protest brings us another example of a spontaneity, right? So say like there was a speech, the president said something that you didn't like. Actually, this is one of the main examples is in 2001 Argentina, that the president said there is an economic crisis, there's social turmoil, there are lootings, it's a chaotic situation. So I decree a curfew. Nobody can leave their homes, okay? And people were really enraged, and they completely disregarded the president's mandate and took to the streets. But what happened after the speech, or in the context of the speech, as the speech was happening on TV, people started banging pots and pans to show discontent, and then they converged in the streets. So the protest started in the buildings, in the private space, as a personal rejection of the president's speech. And then everybody was like, oh, so somebody thinks like me because I can hear the dissent, right? And then they became a critical mass to show that it wasn't well taken off. The mandate wasn't well received. And in this case, so you see the contrast between the choreographed, the arranged, the scheduled, and the spontaneous. And in this case, also, we bring the issue of instrumentality or pragmatism. Everybody has a pot or a pan in their home and a wooden spoon. And also the symbolic aspect of the protest performance, which is we don't have any more food in our to cook. So this protest is it's fun, and it has been appropriated. Actually, if you want to show the next one, let's see. Oh, so yeah, we have this here. Let's go to the George Floyd one. So since we are in the cacerola, so yeah, so you can see, for example, in the U.S., we know less what a curfew is, right? And so in the summer of 2019, within the context of the pandemic and within the context of Black Lives Matter, rebellion, people appropriated the cacerolazo, and when there was a curfew decreed, they still protested for the the killing of George Floyd from the privacy of their homes. So they were not resisting the mandate, but they were still making their voices heard and becoming as a unified collective that was rejecting the status quo, right? Which is that Black people are killed by police and with no accountability for the forces. And here, what is interesting is that this person tweets and says, an hour-long pot banging session post curfew, and then he says, I really regret not having written Cacerolazo instead of the grotesque pot banging session, because he says we can link our struggles, right? If I name this as a Cacerolazo, I hint at my solidarity with, and building on the legacy of Latin American protests.
Wonderful. And so that brings me to another question, Marcela. And you give us plenty of examples, and especially in your book, you give plenty of examples of protests in Latin America, specifically in Chile, Argentina, and Mexico. So my
Mm-hmm.
question is there a very strong history of popular mobilization and human rights in those countries that can be then uh, be an example or be used for others to extend on those efforts in terms of
Mm-hmm.
social justice?
Yes, and so we can move to la Madres de Plaza de Mayo, the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo. I was telling Mariana that some people are, yeah, that's gonna be the
I
Cacerolazo
clicked
for George
something.
Floyd.
Sorry.
Yes,
I think I clicked something. Are you
I
still
wanna,
able to
yes,
view? Okay,
yes,
excellent.
I actually wanted to show you the Cacerolazo for George Floyd, but it's gonna take us to connectivity issues. So I was telling Mariana, the mothers of Plaza de Mayo are the paradigmatic example, and some Latin American sisters and brothers get in, they are like, oh, we're tired of the same example always, right? But it's really crucial. We have a lot to learn from them. They are really old. Many of them are already have passed away. The mothers of Plaza de Mayo are a great example of human rights activism because they started as like mothers, just a mother looking for their disappeared children. Sounds like 4 or 5 year olds, but it was like 20, 30-year old political dissidents who were kidnapped by the military dictators, right? And so like these people were not coming home, and the mothers were like, I don't know where my son or daughter are. They started meeting in police departments. Nobody told them what had happened. This was a tactic, right, from the military to disappear people. They claimed, well, they're nowhere to be found, so case closed, and the mothers insisted that this was not fair, that this was not right, that they if anything they deserved a trial, and this was not the case. And so they, from becoming single people affected by this issue of their children's kidnapping, they got together, and in a moment in which nobody could take to the streets or even gather in the streets, they gathered, as you see in the picture on the left. They wore their children's diapers actually at the beginning. Then they became they use these handkerchiefs, headscarves that are representative of them, and they put the issue on public view, right? In a moment in which there was no dissent whatsoever towards the military junta. So they showed there was something going on in Argentina. There were human rights violations in Argentina, right? And what is striking is that from becoming, affected, loose, people, they became an activist organization, and they had a lot to do with the trial to the junta members, that the military were brought to justice. And even today, they are a referent for like, human rights violations and the rule of law and justice, and the right to, to express your opinions and even build a better future and a better society, right? But what I like from them is exactly that they defied the military, which is like, mostly male, masculine force, with this image of motherhood, right? Like older, they said they didn't have any political affiliation. Diana Taylor actually questions that because she says, well, while they are defying the military, they are also performing gender and gender roles in a very, normative, patriarchal way, right? The mothers themselves reject the notion that what they were doing was a performance, because some people had take issue with the label of performance because of the anti-theatrical prejudice, right? That we sometimes, as you can see on the media, performance has a bad connotation of being fake, being a put on, and being spectacular and superficial. But in their case, what we are calling attention to is that it was brilliantly, performance as a medium,
Or
right? Like the way in which they marched together, they marched in a way that was sort of like non-threatening. So there was a lot to think about.
yeah, and using the symbols, right? Using
Yes,
the pañuelos or
yes. And a symbol that,
headpieces.
yes, the headpieces then helped other activists in Turkey, in Central America, to really, build on that legacy and believe that they could be agents of change, that they could overcome fear and really gain some power through, like not taking arms necessarily, not fighting violence with violence, but in this other way of, as I said, gaining support from the society, right? Like the society started rejecting and saying, look, this is not right. Because we have to understand, many people supported the military, okay? And so when we started learning from them that babies were kidnapped, that the children of the disappeared were kidnapped, that their property was ransacked, the society started paying attention to what was happening. And so here we see then like a more recent example of, like, mothers and families performing memory, right? So because we go from mourning to the practice of memory and to maintaining demands and claims, right? And one of the ways memory is performed is that, we didn't say it, but one of the slogans of the mothers is like, aparición con vida. They still claim that their sons and daughters need to come back, right? Because they are disappeared. So something that we learned in 9/11, how difficult it is to not be able to mourn the person you lost, right? To not know what happened with that person. And this is what happened with the 43 kidnapped students from a teacher's college in Ayotzinapa in Mexico, who also disappeared. And the government said, again, their bodies are missing, or we just found these remains, we're not sure, maybe it's them, but well, move on. We need to move on. And the families remain. So in a way, performance and activism and protests were being shown that it's necessary, right, to keep the society engaged in that agenda, especially in a moment in which information and breaking news changes from one day to the other, right? Like an issue that is crucial today, tomorrow we're like, oh, that's news from yesterday, right?
Yeah, and I think that it is the slogan there. If we can translate it, is so powerful. And let me know if I translate that correctly. So it says, "Vivos se los llevaron," so they took them alive. So we want them alive. We want them back alive, right?
Yes,
Vivos se
yes.
los llevaron, con vida lo queremos. So it's a very
Mhm.
powerful slogan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we keep moving, Marcela, so that we cover?
Yes,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Hmm. And so here we see building and solidarity, right? Because this is London, Black Lives Matter protests around, the summer of
Sorry.
protests. So we were talking about memory, right? Memory and persistence, the possibility. And I told you at the beginning of this, at the beginning of this session, that performance also enables the activists themselves to not get exhausted, to keep the fight, right? To keep people galvanized, right? And so that's important for, when things become old and we need to perform memory and to persist in our claim. But also, what does protest and performance have to do with the future, right? And here we can see some transnational solidarity, how through, all the reactions to the assassination of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the long list, societies in different countries not only express solidarity to what was happening in the U.S., but also had their own local reckonings, right? Like, how is this thing that happens there have to do with our own, minorities and anti-black violence, etc., right? And so what I think it's interesting and very striking in this picture is like the um, how this protester connects today, tomorrow, and forever, but also we are the change, right? Like that these protests, these ways of coming together make people feel they can have an impact in transformation, right? They can be agents of change. That silence won't lead you anywhere, as Baudrillard says. Complicity is not what we should do to be complicit. I mean, like, that silence is to be complicit, right? We have to take a stance, and we have to really take hands into the matters. And this is democracy, right? Because it's not just our representatives who are those who can change society, but it's us together as well. One thing maybe it's important to say at this point is that protests in Latin America, there is a strong tradition about taking to the streets, occupying public space, and feeling we have a say, as I was saying, right? And so the idea of participatory grassroots, uh, horizontal democracy, and ways in which in the protests, which some people see, especially Black Lives Matter protests, have very bad rep in the media, and the Chicano movement. I mean, there are multiple examples, right? We're gonna see, I don't know, more. But so people feel sometimes that protest is disruptive, that they become violent, they are disrupted. So you have to understand that in public space, in protest, and in processing as a collective, we are also as a part of democratic processes. We are getting our political education about our role, what to be a citizen of, right? Like something that we hear a lot in university context as well, right? Like, who is a good citizen in the department, who contributes to the community.
Sorry,
The
I cut
slogan.
your thought right there,
Yeah.
right?
No,
I'm
I
trying to
mean,
get through.
yes. Now, in terms of the previous slide, the issue of police brutality, right? So it's like, okay, what would it take to stop the issue of police brutality? We have to think about where we're spending funds, right? So protests are not only demands or like rejections; they are also proposals for change, right? They are moving the issue forward, and ways of theorizing. So why is this happening? Who is responsible, and how should we think about it differently, right? Proposals of taking care of mental health rather than just showing up with guns to a distressed person, right? People with disabilities suffer a lot of police violence as well, so that's something So this is in terms of like agendas for the future. So in terms of I don't know more, again, the importance of slogans, right? I don't know more. We accepted the normalized situation. This is a protest about, a law that was giving away with treaties. So it was about culture. It was about indigenous sovereignty. It was about waterways. You know that indigenous populations are really working for all of us in terms of natural resources, climate change, and so yeah. So I also like the idea of analyzing slogans, which are hashtags today. The role of hashtags in how we approach and how we understand what is going on.
Wonderful. Marcela, at this point, I would really like to ask you about this idea of constellation. So, but before we get there, perhaps we can talk about these elaborations you do about the on and offline synergies, how basically street protests and digital protests fit to each other, how they build together a momentum. And I don't know if I am in the right slide, if you want me to go through a few
Let's go
more.
to the book, to the cover of the book.
Okay.
So
There.
the idea, yeah. So the idea of performance constellations is basically to contest the separation of the digital and the streets and the hierarchy, right? Usually, if the digital is always talked about as the precursor, the part, sort of like complementary resource to help protests be successful in the streets, right? So it's like the preliminary to gather in the streets. So the street face to face is always privilege, right? And so my claim is that the digital is not just that; it's very important in terms of that, but there's also like a space to protest, a performative space where bodies even are, uh, displayed there. So embodiment, I analyze what is it on the internet that it's embodied, right? Because it's important for performance, but also like the ways in which now, as you all know, because you're all displaced from somewhere, we can participate in protests from afar, right? And so some people reject the internet and the digital because they think it's prone to clicktivism or slacktivism or couch activism, as I said, performative alliance. But for me, it's a space too important to disregard. And many theoreticians talk about like the role of affect, right? So it's not just the means of communication, but it's a means for us to get involved affectively in very concrete ways. And so the idea of performance constellations is to show this imbrication between the online and the offline, to question the hierarchy between them, and to also show how, but for example, by tracking hashtags, we can learn how a protest has evolved, the different arguments the activists were making. And so, one of the things we see, for example, is like what is digital activism, what different ways it took. So it's something that starts in the 90s, and this comes through, the first example is virtual sit-ins by the Electronic Disturbance Theater, which was more hacktivism, right? And so it was experts creating a program for protesters to have an impact or a say on it, or to perform support or alliance with the Zapatistas who were in Chiapas, a very remote area, right? The Zapatistas are one of the first movements that really used the internet, despite our thinking that indigenous communities don't know about technology. They actually showed us how this was needed, as we see it with the Myanmar activists today. Movements need transnational solidarity, right? And so the Zapatistas understood this in their fight against the Mexican government for extractive projects that were, messing up their land and their livelihoods. And so the Electronic Disturbance Theater, a group that comes from a Chicano activism tradition, Teatro Campesino, that I know the students of Professor Dexter are learning in her class. So building on those traditions, they created this hacktivist practice that was what they thought electronic civil disobedience. How they said, today the streets are dead capital. They don't matter. Capital is on the internet. So that's the space where we should disrupt and protest. And so what I track in the book is that how digital activism and how the relationship between, the physical and the digital space starts with a very, very kind of like expert world, that so the experts were helping activists to have these tools. But as we see the progression and with social media, everybody can start the campaign. I mean, we had to talk about the digital divide and lack of resources and bandwidth, as we know with Zoom. But pretty much everybody can have a voice and perform dissent or solidarity online. So if you want, yeah, so this is for the Zapatistas, their own practices of collectivity with their masks. These are the Zapatista women who gathered in their own encuentro in 2018, and because of the continuous fight and paramilitary violence in Chiapas, they had to suspend the 2019 encuentro, but they asked activists to perform solidarity towards them and to express their own struggles in a dispersed way. So they said, no, we're not going to converge on Chiapas for an encuentro, for a meeting, for a gathering. We're going to express collectivity in dispersed, disseminated ways. And so we'll move to the next slide. So there were multiple, so this was the encuentro initially. Thousands of women from all over the world went to talk about gender violence in their sites of, life and patriarchal societies. And so this was a very successful in-presence encuentro. And then in 2019, we had people performing with these lights, candle vigils, encuentros everywhere in support of the Zapatista women, but also to talk about the way they confront violence in their societies. And in the next slide, so all these images circulate on social media. So instead of talking about physical space presence convergence, we talk about a convergence at a distance, right? So you get the idea of the constellation, right? So we are a cluster, but even when we are disseminated, right?
Yes, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you this kind of complex interdependency or interdependent relationship between the virtual and the in-person, in-bodies protests. So what are the challenges with digital activism in particular?
Well, yes, yeah, we have to think about that first. That we are not the only actors online. We depend on algorithms, like other people, kind of like script our performance as well in very present ways. So this was the question that Jack Dorsey from Twitter was asked, because Twitter algorithms reward polemics, right? And so everybody to get likes wants to be the wisest, the smartest ass of the smartest asses, right? And so that's the fact that everybody has a space to voice, and spread, like, right? So algorithms, the way these platforms are structured, but also the question of disinformation campaigns, how somebody posts something and then we take it for truth and we reproduce it. The question that we don't see each other, like, see, for example, like online, we don't see who is posting, right? So we talked yesterday about trolls posing for Black Lives Matter activists, or there was a campaign of like Democrats saying they were fleeing the party, and this was all Russian trolls. So there is a big problem also in terms of like, how these networks are, available to just anyone, right? So we have to. What I claim in the book is that instead of saying, "Oh, they are not good, they are trash," we have to learn. We have to learn how they work. Cyber feminists help us think that we can use these tools and create algorithms. Some people talk about poetry as an algorithm. Like uh, Alex Juhas actually has a project that is about slowing down and using, sort of like being in conversation with social media, but through poetry, right? And this is like some people talk about la ciudadanización de las redes sociales. Actually, our president, Mariana, Presidente Alberto Fernández, in his inaugural discourse speech, he said he really knew that these tools are crucial, but that we have to be better citizens in them, right? Be responsible citizens in them.
Great. I have a couple more slides, but I wanted to round up to kind of the final thoughts about with all this research and understanding the power of performance as a mechanism for defending democracy. What gives you hope, right? How we can use performance for the good?
Yeah. Um, I, my Puerto Rican students, but a couple of years ago, they said, protest, it doesn't work. Like, we are a colony, this is not going to change. But I was there when they ousted Ricky Rosello. It was amazing. They didn't even know they could do that, right? So sometimes, you just have to do it. Sometimes, partially, sometimes you protest because you cannot stay home, you cannot stay silent. You protest because it's something that you have to do, and then you see the results. So the other part of performance is that the performativity part, right? That in doing the action, we are already transforming the situation. We are becoming a different community. We are becoming a community, or we're like rehearsing what being a community is, right? And so I think this is a contested word, the issue of community, because somebody told me, well, you have to earn, being a member of my community, right? So it's not just because you read something about anti-blackness that I'm gonna consider you part of my community, right? But at the same time, we see especially in Latin America, what activists say, luchar sirve, right? To fight, we have to give the fight, and it has its returns, right? Sometimes it's short term, sometimes it's like it takes many shots, it takes many tries, it takes persistence, but we get to returns, and that gives us hope, because we are listened, and our representatives change, so if you do something that is not right, and people think, okay, and nobody responds, people think, okay, they like the policy, so I'm gonna keep at it, right? And so we have to keep having our representatives accountable, but also it's on us, right? So many movements are saying, I don't ask everything from the state, right? It's also on us. And that's why all that has happened with mutual aid in this current conundrum, and especially in Texas, as I saw. So there are layers, right? The part of like, okay, how this electric grid works, and the decisions that went into that, and the reasons for those decisions, but also in terms of, like, how can we be safer, and live lives free of violence, right? And so that slide about like dignity, right? When dignity becomes the norm, the custom, and lastly, Frederick Douglass, who said, power concedes nothing without a fight, right? And I think that encapsulates absolutely everything. We can fight in different ways, so you don't have to risk, because putting bodies on the line is also dangerous. So you have to kind of be tactical about how to do it without risking your life as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think that now it's time. I believe that Andrea could unmute herself now. So this is time for having a little bit of a conversation with everyone. So if you have questions for Marcela, you can put those on the chat right now. And Andrea will be monitoring those questions, and we can have a little response Q&A time.
Just while people are writing, I'm sure they are, um, I share a link for finding the book online, and thanks to Professor Raina Dexter also put the link for it available through the Kennedy Library. So if you're interested in looking at the Constellation, it's available. It's available to you.
Wonderful. And I'm going
Yes,
to put
thank you.
the little survey that I was mentioning before. So, but I need a second to find my my writings on that. Very well. It's right here.
The book is available on Amazon, but if we're true activists, we should buy it from the publisher, from the University of Michigan Press, so we can decouple from Amazon.
So I'm inviting everyone to complete this very short survey. This is for everyone that is willing. This is voluntary and absolutely anonymous. So if you would like to complete the survey, you can go on. Excellent. In there. Very well. So we had the opportunity to talk to Marcela yesterday and to do a little in a class, right? And to do a little exercise. I don't have my pen in here, but that was very educational, right? Because we all got to bang on our pens and to recreate, assume, if you will, sort of protest. So I'm very interested, in all of these exercises that can get us closer to to embody even in a digital platform like Zoom. So have you done other exercises like that in the past, or was just that occurred to you for this class?
Well, I have to tell you, I taught performance and activism in digital culture in the fall. And one of the exercises was precisely to talk about the idea of algorithmic theater, which is a thing, right? Very out of our hands because it's very technical. But we took that idea, we coupled it with the notion of fluxus events and scores, and I asked the students to hack Zoom, right? And I was like, wow, today is going to be a mess. Everybody's going to be, it's too difficult. I don't know how to do it. And we did games. Like people, the students were great. They brought different ways of, like, say, for example, one student asked us, which I kind of wanted to do it yesterday, to change our names and to put person as our name, right? And so we had like 10 people, person this, person that, and to, you know, uh, take the image, so sort of like the individualized. And then the game continued. I don't remember right now, but it was brilliant. We had the best time. And so I think that it was, becoming a community and being playful with it and thinking about how the platform conditions the way we communicate and trust each other or not. I think Zoom it's an amazing thing to think about, right? It helps us connect. So I'm able to be with you all today, but it has its issues. For race talks. Black people have talked about, how virtual backgrounds and facial recognition work on it. And some of you might say, men still talk a lot in meetings, so like, I think we should have like, you have been talking for like 10 minutes, or like you have interrupted this person. So there are a lot of layers to talk about. And for performance is great as well, how we can facilitate a different, I think, this is not a protest, but it's a way of, again, like being aware of the medium, the media we are connecting through, and how we can, from those circumstances, be agents in it, shape our relations.
We
I
have a
think we have a question, right? Sorry.
Yes, we have a couple of questions in the chat here. The first one comes from Lena Dexter. Can you speak to the difference in what we mean by performativity in performance studies, in contrast to how online activism is sometimes referred to as, quote, performative, end quote, in popular and social media?
I'm having trouble hearing you, Andrea.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can repeat it if you find it in the chat. It's a question posed by Reina, and it says, "Can you speak to the difference in what we
Yeah.
mean by performativity in performance studies in contrast to how online activism is sometimes referred to as
Yes.
performative?"
Yes. Thank you so much. It's huge. I was like, oh my God, we are in trouble. They're going to hate us. We are completely insignificant. Yes. So performative allyship or performative activism, and everything performative right now in public opinion is fake, is narcissistic, is like feel good, kind of like click and do nothing. And also, as I said, narcissistic in terms of draws attention to sort of like a self publicity, right? That does nothing to contribute to the movement, that takes the spot from the actual people doing the work, and leadership from them. The way we talk about performativity is about, well, first, in a very simple way, things that are interactive, that incorporate the audience. Like, say, for example, in like an interactive website, right? So what is performative online? That's important to clarify. Performativity, again, it has to do with how norms are consolidated through repetition. Like, it's a big word, performativity, in gender studies, gender performance. How we are not of a gender, but we become of a gender because we perform according to the norms, right? So that's one of the big words in understandings of this concept in performance studies. And also the issue of effects, right? So performativity in terms of like something that doesn't show what is, but that by doing we become, like, again, taking from Judith Butler. So we were talking with Mariana about, like, the idea of performance in activism is not just like a theatrical put on, but also a way, as I said with the Puerto Rican activists, a way in which we come to understand our own power by making, right? And that we are transforming. So another big way of understanding this concept is how something that we see as intangible, the work of imagination, can have material effects, okay? So even like, for example, Augusto Boal talks about theater as a rehearsal for revolution, right? My cat is meowing, sorry. I'll be back, but we
Yeah.
can continue. See, like, talk about disruption, the protest. He wants to
My
open the door. Great. Perfect. So
my cat was doing the same, and I felt bad. It's like scratching, probably not good, not behaving. I think that we have the last question right here, right, Andrea?
Yes, we do. Can you hear me better now?
yes,
Great. Okay. Yes, we have a two-part question. The first part is, from your perspective, how do we bring the solidarity and collectiveness that is in the group actions to our personal beliefs and practices?
yes, many ways to go about it. I like that you included faith in your um, cluster of words that we have to work about. I think, part of performance, social media activism, it's about rhetorics, right? Persuading, trying to persuade, trying to understand also, right? So it's like trying to persuade and trying to understand. So I think we have to be better. We have to work at listening more and trying to understand where does people come from, why they have that view. Some people, they don't think their behaviors affect, the way they have been exposed to, the way they live in the world has not has not have the input of minorities, for example. So that's why I think universities are great, because that's when we get the most of our education. I also know that for students it's difficult to come from certain beliefs and contexts, and be thrown and told that they have to change, right? So we have to really do the work. It's a sustained and patient work. Sometimes we need a faster response, like precisely I think the pandemic is really like a call of attention to how costly it can be, that we cannot overlook inequality right now. We see the case of Brazil, for example. It's a complete genocide at this point. And so I don't know if I got the question right, but and also I think, also, like, many people are belonging to movements, but with reservations, right? So that is the personal and the community, right? So you don't have to completely you can have disagreements, right? You can still keep some of your beliefs. I know for young people, their identity, what they grew up thinking is the truth, is important. But that's what I think, that listening and trying to understand where the other comes from, and practices that we understand as empathic sometimes, which is also like another contested word, can be helpful. We have to become better at making arguments and not becoming super impatient, um, and listening. As much as it might seem completely weird, some people might disagree. What's the north star of the constellation is to think about, how your actions might be deadly for others, like, so in terms of, majorities and minorities, but also sometimes it's like, who is the most vulnerable, who's going to be really affected by your claiming that that person doesn't have the right to do that, for example, right?
There,
That's
there's
great.
another question. Yeah, Andrea, you can read the question. I would advise Marcela, if you would like to open the chat, because this is a long one. So,
Okay.
There,
yeah, so
there was a
And
second question to the one that came prior from Karen Vanessa Cepeda Rivera.
mm,
And she asked, can you recommend to us authors who write about performance memory?
mm. Oh, so yes, thank you. Women Mobilizing Memory is the book where I got the etymology of protest. I forgot to cite them. Women Mobilizing Memory, University of Columbia Press, is like a collective. It's very beautiful. It includes a lot of examples about, walks in Turkey, connections between the mothers in Chile and mothers in Turkey, Black Lives Matter as well. So I highly recommend that book. Marianne Hirsch talks about intergenerational post memory, what she calls post memory, about like the children of people, actually the children of parents who suffered the Holocaust. So how the memory works intergenerationally, even if you didn't experience that event, right? And so important in terms, like what is passed on, even when you have not lived that sort of life. And of course, Diana Taylor has her recent book called Presente, precisely Presente, the politics of presence, I think. And she talks about memes, memetic memory. So that's important, an important book to check out too.
Wonderful, thank you. The last question we have in the chat comes from a performance studies major, Shana Ambers. And this is quite long, but the lead up makes perfect sense. It says, "Hello, I currently hope to attend graduate school to study the effects of artists at risk, artists whose bodies are included in their protest art, versus artists who risk, such as online activists, etc., on inciting societal change. As you stated in your presentation, putting bodies on the line is dangerous. How do you feel the effects of protest art correlate to the degree of risk assumed by protesters?
Mm.
Can online protest art be as effective as in-person protest art, despite the difference in assumed physical risk?"
Wow. I would love to hang out with you. This is like we have to talk through. So brilliant, great question. It gives me a lot to think about. So what I'm thinking, yes, there is an element of risk, right? That you have to risk something. You have to show, part of protest requires that, so that you show that you care, right? And I think that that's also part of what Black Lives Matter activists say about performative allyship, right? The example of the Seattle protest, the Portland protest, in which those with privilege, lighter skin, white people, mothers, even another example of mothers, went to the front line to protect the people who the police would go after, right? The problem with the women's march, that black women said, we're not going, this is completely, it's very race, like the police is not doing anything and they kill us, right? So the idea of, like, even you see how the role, that the tactical role that different bodies can play in a protest, right? Like, I'm talking in maybe we can invite them on Tuesday. I'm talking about La Primera Línea in Chile, the young men who go first and covered to protect the protesters from the police. So they are the first line, in between the police and the other protesters, so that the protest would not be canceled. But, and they confront the police body to body, right? And women have started using also balaclavas with colors, and they run around. So they do a different choreography to kind of distract and take attention from the first line, who have been condemned because they are masked, and people are like, well, they are violent, they are out to not good. And so the women showed solidarity, and they showed their own understanding of their role, in that protest. That's for an exhibit that is called Protest and the Recuperation, and that includes visual artists. So I'm thinking, for your question, I'm thinking, no, the internet is not necessarily safe. Women know, cyber activists, cyber feminists know this, because we have bullying. Human rights protesters in Central America are even, threats, death threats, and the like. And so There is a group. I'll give Mariana this data. There is a group that is working exactly on this. They do workshops, to help human rights protectors who use the internet to have safer practices to protect themselves, to not overexpose. So you see that yeah, so it's not necessarily safe. The internet is not necessarily safe. In terms of your research, you should look at the work of Patrick Anderson, who is from Performance Studies Northwestern. Well, graduated, he's a professor, but he works on like hunger strikes, like really pushing the issue of risk, and even how somebody just by themselves can be effective as well, right? We can talk about, in another session, we could talk about crowds versus individual actions that also could be important. But Patrick would be an interesting case. I love your research project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shaina, also for your question. And I think we need to bring this to a close now. Because we've been chatting for almost an hour and a half. So we are absolutely thrilled to have you. We thank you so much, Marcela, for spending time with us and sharing your brilliant ideas and your research on protest and activism. We've learned a lot, and we had some thought-provoking ideas to process and to begin to think about. And it's been a pleasure to have you, and we hope to have you back. Now that we have all this virtual thing, it's easier to stay connected. We just got another. I will do now is just to close the recording. So I'm going to thank everyone. Thank you so much, Andrea, for helping us today in the technical assistance and also monitoring the questions. Thanks everyone for being here today. It seems like there might be some questions coming on the chat, so what I will do is stop the recording and say bye to everyone in here. And if you would like to stay, hang out, and ask some questions directly, we can do that right now. So thank you so much, and I will see you next week for another Race Talks.
Thank you so much. This was lovely. It was fun, and keep up the good work. Unfortunately, I have to leave because I have the meeting to coordinate